Hi, welcome to ThreatTraq Essentials. We're going to take a look at some everyday cybersecurity lessons we can learn from this week's ThreatTraq stories. I'm here with Matt Kaiser, who's on the show this week. Thanks for being on the show, Matt. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine, Don. How are you doing?
Let's talk about the stories we covered this week. Let's start with yours, which is about ways of detecting web shells. Tell me first, what are web shells?
So web shells are little bits of code that an attacker might try and upload to a website in order to gain control over it. And they provide a much easier to use interface than some other attack method.
And now there's new ways of detecting them, correct?
Well, they're the same old ways, but the NSA and the ASD, which is the Australian counterpart, they've both put out guidance and some tools to help people detect and defend against web shells, which is very helpful.
Is this something for the average user? Is this something more for system administrators? Tell me some advice we want to give people here.
So I think system administrators are the ones who will really benefit from this. But if you're not familiar with web shells and you have an interest in learning more about cybersecurity, this is actually a really good starting point. The PDF document provided by these two groups walks you through it, tells you what they are, and the different ways in which you might detect or defend against web shells on your web server. And I find it to be pretty interesting. There are a few things in there that I was already familiar with, but the tools that they provide at the end made the job of doing things like checking for changes on your server much easier.
Well, speaking of education, Jim Clausing brought us a story about some new malware reverse engineering tools. First of all, tell me what those things are.
So most of us are familiar with malware, malicious software. Reverse engineering is the process of taking something and breaking it down and understanding it by taking it apart. And for malware reverse engineering, the reason people do this is so that they can understand how malware works and then devise defenses against them. So any tools that people build make that job easier. So the stuff that Jim shared, which I'm personally very excited about, would, would allow you to more quickly and more effectively take apart malware, understand what it's doing, and develop your defenses against it.
And Manny Ortiz also brought us an interesting story. Again, I think it's going to be very educational for our audience about algorithms, and particularly how the challenges that algorithms and supply chains for things like groceries, some of those challenges may have a way of teaching us about algorithms and cybersecurity. So tell me about that. Tell me, first of all, what algorithms are.
So algorithms are basically, in the very purest sense, a set of steps that you take to solve a problem. And when we talk about algorithms in the supply chain space, which is what this article talks about, we're talking about taking a look at purchases over time and putting things in stock based on previous purchases, doing sort of prediction to say, I know that at this time of year, the following things are more in need, or, there are things that I know I need to stock up on because maybe in a month, there's going to be a rush. People are going to want to buy, for example, pool noodles when the pool's open, or sunscreen, or swim trunks, those sorts of things.
Now, tell me how in cybersecurity, how algorithms are used typically.
So they're used in similar but different ways. A lot of the times what we'll use algorithms for is to see what patterns are apparent in our data, and then decide if behavior is within acceptable boundaries or outside of acceptable boundaries. One example would be if you've got somebody who typically works from the office and is suddenly working from home, that would be something that an analyst might want to investigate. Similarly, if you've got somebody who works from home all the time but sticks to the 9 to 5 hours for their time zone, and suddenly they're remoting in not only at 2 in the morning, but from a completely different IP address than they're used to, that is also something that's worth investigating. By itself, it may not mean that this is malicious, but it is worth digging into on the off chance that it is.
So I think what we're talking about here is the fact that this pandemic has definitely created a disruption in supply chains because of people's behavior, and hence the algorithms may have to be adjusted and interpreted differently if you're doing groceries. But the same thing you guys were talking about is possibly happening in cybersecurity. Tell me about what some of those issues are.
For sure. So a lot of companies have moved a lot of their employees to work from home over a VPN or some sort of other remote access solution. Now, going back to the examples I gave about VPN access, if you've got employees who, throughout their entire career at a company, have never used the VPN and are suddenly using the VPN, that is outside of the baseline that you've established for what normal VPN behavior is for that user. Likewise, if you've got people working from home and they're getting work in between taking care of the kids and dealing with feeding their family or taking care of pets, the hours that they might work may change. So any assumptions you have previously about what the normal work hours are for a regular person, you have to throw them out the window. So ultimately, you're dealing with a lot more false positives until you retune your algorithms to reflect what the new normal is.
So there's going to be a lot of lessons that will be learned from this experience for cybersecurity professionals, correct?
Absolutely. I think Jim hit on a bunch of really interesting ones in terms of incident response and business continuity. Basically, the sorts of things that you would exercise in the case of an emergency. A lot of these plans are being exercised now, and we may be finding out that some of them may not actually work in practice. So you have to change, you have to adapt, and you have to develop plans so that in the future, if you have another situation that requires quick response, you have the capability to respond in a reasonable fashion. I think one example we had was software licenses. You know, on a normal day when you can plan ahead and say, I will need the following number of licenses to allow people to connect to my VPN, that's great. But when you have a crunch and you have to get hundreds or thousands of people onto the VPN in the next couple of days in order for your business to function, you need a faster process or a more elegant way of handling that.
So a lot of lessons will come out of this whole experience that'll be able to keep us safe online in the future.
I believe so.
All right, well, great, Matt. Thank you for being on the show this week. Thank you all for watching. As always, like and subscribe below so you can keep up with this latest expert advice each week. And if you want to take a deeper dive into any of these stories, click on the playlist below and you can explore them further. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.